Coming up on this week's show, play Windows 98 games on your Xbox Series X.
New Dreamcast VMUs are coming.
And we take a look at Rare's handheld history with Paul Machacek.
And the Retro Hour podcast is brought to you each and every week with our amazing friends at Bitmap Books. Now, one of their books I think you should check out, A Gremlin in the Works, celebrating one of Britain's best software companies from back in the day and featuring interviews with legends like Tony Crowther, Sean Southern, Ben Daglish, and lots more as well. You can check that out on the rest of their retro gaming collection at bitmapbooks.com. Hello and welcome to the Retro Hour podcast, episode number 335, your weekly dose of retro gaming and technology news with me, Dan Wood.
Me, Ravi Abbott.
And me, Joe Fox.
And a very warm welcome to this week's show, where each and every Friday we take you back in time to the good old days of video games, reminiscing about those days we used to rent games for our Sega Mega Drive from Blockbuster, maybe getting on your BMX on a Saturday, down to your local shop to get tapes for your Commodore 64, maybe those endless summers in the seaside arcades. See, if I think of summer as a kid, just arcades was such a big part of it back then.
I was outside playing, Dan. Yeah. I know what you mean. But
I was sat in a dark room. I was, playing Super Nintendo and Mega Drive. I'm with you, Dan. I'm with you.
Well, that's the thing, because at the moment we're going through a heat wave here in the UK, and apparently this weekend it could get up to like 40 degrees in parts of the country. And I've pretty much been locked inside all day today in my air-conditioned studio. I went out for a little bit to do something we'll talk about in just a moment. But I was reminded of a joke that the late comedian Bill Hicks said. The reason that he didn't like going to the beach is because he goes to the beach and everyone there has got bronze skin and white teeth. And he's the opposite way around. He's got bronze teeth and white skin. That's me.
Well, you always love to rub it in with your aircon. We've had to turn our fans off because of the heat and the interview at the moment. So, yeah. But it has been hot, and we've been posting a few pictures of stuff that we've put out, and it has, of course, sparked debate, which always happens. If you're retro-brighting or you're trying to reverse the yellow in a kind of machine, is it damaging it? Is it going to melt or kind of cause an issue? What have you been doing with your stuff, Dan?
Well, you actually inspired me to do this the other day, because I know you got your hands on a classic Mac.
Yes,
and the keyboard was
rather yellow Mac as well.
And you sent me a picture of it just out in your garden in this like baking sunshine that we had the other day. And I thought, because I did a video recently on my Sega Dreamcast, and my Dreamcast, I don't know what happened to it, but it is so yellow. It's like, it looks like it was in like a smoker's home or something. It's literally been in like a cupboard for about 10 years. I don't know why it got so yellow. But I thought, well, I'll give it a try. I'll just put it out in the sunshine. Because there is that method. I mean, there's kind of different methods of reversing the yellowing. There's one where you put peroxide and everything on it and cover it in cling film. But also this new one that really, I think, Perry Fractic, Christian, he did a video on it a couple of years ago, and it's kind of blown up since then, that you just put your systems out in the sunshine without any chemicals, and that slowly reverses the yellowing that happens on these old plastics. And I've got to say, I left my Dreamcast out there for about 4 hours. And I posted a picture on our Facebook page. It made a massive difference.
Yeah, it really does. And I think it's interesting because some people say, oh, do it with chemicals, it's easier. Some people say, oh, you could damage the machine and stuff like that. I think it's up to the individual what they kind of do with the machine. But being a sunny day, I have been putting my machines out, and I haven't had the same effect that you've had. I've not had it work as well, but I don't know if it's the type of plastic.
I was going to say, Dan, when Dan sent those pictures over, I was like, he's just swapped that out. He has. That's just a different dream.
He's put a filter on it.
Yeah. He's put a filter on it or something. But yours didn't look that much better, did it? Really, Ravi?
No.
I've not risked it myself, but it was interesting looking at all the comments, and even one of the comments was just like, oh, so you're telling me I've spent years and years and years of keeping my games in the dark to stop them from yellowing. We now put them outside to make them yellow.
Yeah, apparently the cause is also the cure.
Yeah, so I was just like, oh yeah, that is a good point. But Dan's proved there is method in the madness, and some other people were showing us pictures. A fella called Simon commented in, which I loved. He had his NES sprawled out as if it was sunbathing, like with the controllers and everything on top of his shed, which I just loved. Even closer to the sun.
Also, be aware that I think, Dan, you warped something a few years ago, didn't you? When you were doing some like retro writing and stuff. So it is, you've got to keep an eye on it. It is kind of, don't use your like one-off rare machine that's, irreplaceable or something really expensive.
And depending on where you live as well, I mean, if you live in an even warmer climate than we have at the moment, I imagine I've seen pictures on Facebook groups of like melted Commodore 64s in gardens in Vegas and stuff like that.
If you're living on the equator, then don't get your machine out.
So even though us nerds have been cowering inside playing video games, at least our consoles have been out enjoying the sunshine over the last couple of days. Now, we've got a really good show for you this week. Of course, all the big retro and tech stories to talk about from over the last 7 days in just a moment. And of course, every week on this show, we bring you a veteran of the industry to give us their story and give us a bit of an insight on the games that they worked on. And this week, you guys have got a really interesting interview that you've just recorded.
Yeah, this was really, really fun. This was with Paul Machacek. We've interviewed quite a few guys from Rare before, and Ravi worked his magic and got Paul on, and he sent over his kind of credentials to me. And I was like, wait, these are all Rare games. These are all amazing games. And we essentially, obviously...
As in the company Rare, not hard to find.
Yeah, as in the company Rare, sorry. And yeah, man, like we got some really, really, really good stuff. We kind of took a really deep dive, with his time spent with the NES, and he worked on games like Beetlejuice and, the kind of relationships that they had with Nintendo and LJR, and also kind of his transition into working on the Game Boy, and really interesting stories there, and his involvement in kind of getting the Battletoads games up off the ground, which I thought was really, really interesting. So it was a really fun interview. Yeah,
it was kind of like a bit of the handheld history and kind of... Rare have done a lot of big console releases and stuff. It's always interesting to see their handheld ports because they were very different from the console releases. And, they always push technology, and he really did. And he was coding before in assembler, and he was, doing stuff on the Amstrad previously. And like you mentioned, they had some third-party companies that they worked with, like... LJN and stuff like that. So it's really interesting to actually look into Rare's history of the kind of handhelds, and they even at one point developed their own handheld, which is a pretty fascinating tale before the Game Boy.
And the Auric One, you talked about that as well, which is a system that, again, we're not that familiar with, so it's always interesting to kind of talk about systems that we haven't covered much on the show before.
Yeah, totally. Like, really interesting, the Auric One as well, and we have a good chat about it.
So a special guest looking at Rare and their handheld history, Paul Machacek, coming up on the show in around half an hour from now. Now, before then, first half of the show, of course, we round up all of the big retro gaming and tech stories from the last 7 days. This one is quite interesting. Now, maybe like me, and you as well, Joe, you've got a brand new Xbox Series X gracing your home theater setup. Of course, one of the most cutting-edge consoles around right now. Very hard to get hold of as well. I mean, I think I was looking for about 8-9 months until I got hold of one.
Yeah,
you're about the same.
It took me a year to get a hold of one, but what was really disappointing was there was no Microsoft Windows 98 on it when I booted it up.
I was hoping for that as well.
Yeah, and I was really disappointed that it wasn't on there, but it is now, isn't it?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting video and an article by a guy called Alex Battaglia on Eurogamer, and he's managed to get Windows 98 running on an Xbox Series X. And not only that, but also he's got 3DFX Voodoo graphics emulated on here too. So that means he's running loads of those kind of late 90s legendary games like Quake, Half-Life, Turok as well, Command and Conquer. So this is a really cool video and something I wasn't aware of that you could do without actually modding your Xbox.
I know you boys like to buy these modern consoles and then run like Pong on them.
Oh yeah, 100%.
Use the 8-core power to do that.
The first thing I played on my Xbox Series X was Contra. The Contra collection. So I was playing NES games on it, but now I could play Unreal and Quake and stuff like that on it. So how is this achieved?
Well, originally there was that video that I think MVG did, didn't he, when he showed the developer mode?
Yeah. And that's the difference, isn't it, between the new PlayStation and the Xbox, is that the Xbox is a lot more open with the developer mode, and that means you can do a lot more hackery and emulation and stuff like that on it.
Well, this method here that he does is actually, you don't even need the developer mode, and I'm actually surprised that this works. I'm not sure whether it's an exploit or maybe this is kind of sandbox, but what he does is he gets RetroArch running on the Xbox.
Okay.
And the way you do this is by literally just going to a website and downloading it. And then you can run it. You run the code directly on your Xbox from the dashboard, which to me kind of feels like that probably shouldn't be allowed on a console, and maybe something that Microsoft will patch at some point.
It sounds like a custom thing, but then I guess they must have some kind of signatures in there that you know, the Xbox sees and then goes, oh, this is an all right piece of software. Because if you're running it out of developer mode, that's pretty insane. It seems to be a DOSBox Pure on RetroArch core, so it must be RetroArch that actually has the the signed code or something. Right, crazy.
Yeah, but the fact you can just download this from a website seems, I mean, because that's generally how, you know, if you're going to hack, for example, like softmod a Wii,
and it's
or
not,
a PlayStation
not on the
3.
App Store, is it? Or
no, it's always at the browser exploits. So it feels a bit dangerous that you can do this, but you can at the moment apparently. So you get DOSBox running via RetroArch, and then, I mean, because you're running DOSBox, that means that you've got the capability then of installing Windows 98, and there's some compromises you've got to make as well. I mean, he said it took him quite a while. So you've got to kind of find the ISO file, and then he FTP'd it over to his Xbox.
I love that. You can't actually like put the ISO in or load it up. You have to FTP it across, which I've used FTP, and like, you know, it can be quite slow. So that's a really interesting method of kind of doing it.
Yeah, I mean, particularly because you've got an optical drive on an Xbox X, but you can't use that apparently. But after a while, I mean, you watch his video, it's about 15 minutes, but kind of condensed down. He's got Windows 98 running on there, and actually it runs pretty well. But the only thing is, RetroArch doesn't currently support USB mice, so that means any games that he plays, and also using Windows 98, you've got to use the analog sticks on the Xbox controller, which, you know, is obviously, I mean, for FPS games, you mentioned that Turok, that was kind of, you know, he's used to playing that on the N64.
Yeah.
So it didn't feel that weird using an Xbox controller for it. But also because, I mean, it's running DOSBox. The DOSBox fork that's on there, DOSBox Pure, has got a virtualized Voodoo accelerator. So really, in terms of performance, he said it's pretty much on par with a Voodoo 2 graphics card. So you can play like, you know, Glide, OpenGL, or Direct 3D titles. They all work fine on here and actually run, you know, up to the standard of a Voodoo 2.
Well, it's interesting as well because it's all based on the CPU. So, you know, I think it was 12 teraflops of GPU, which is just insane computing power, isn't used at all. So
No.
basically the graphics section is not even used. They're just hammering the whole CPU with this. And of course that's going to run well because the CPUs are crazy fast on this. But I just think it's really funny because you're setting this up, you're limiting yourself to not having a disk drive, not having a mouse, and also, you know, you're just doing it in this kind of closed CPU environment. So you're not even using the whole power of the Xbox, but you're running Windows 98. That's the key. Yeah,
I mean, you could play, you know, the new rebooted version of Quake that's on Xbox Game Pass, but, you know, where's the fun in that?
Yeah.
There's also a reboot of Turok, HD version of it as well. Like, I think all these games that he's running have all got, you know, modern versions of them, but like you say, where's the fun in that?
I think one of the comments here on Eurogamer says, has science gone too far? See, stuff like this, it's just because, you know, there's no logical reason why you'd ever want to do it. You do it because you can. You know, it's always interesting to see stuff like that. And, you know, something that you think probably shouldn't be possible on a modern console with, you know, how locked down they generally are. So if you want to check out that video guide, I've got a feeling maybe Microsoft are going to kind of patch this.
You know, I didn't want an Xbox Series X until I saw this, and now this is the killer app for me. I'm going to go out and get one.
You're going to pay £500 for a Windows.
Yeah, and then the next day, Microsoft patch it.
Yeah.
So if you want to check out that video and the article, I'll put that in our show notes at theretrohour.com. Now, of course, we love the Dreamcast. I think, you know, everyone in the retro community, we always rave about how incredible the Dreamcast was, even though it wasn't the biggest commercial success in the world. Over the last 20 years, the retro community definitely taking it under our wing and, show the Dreamcast a lot of love. And it's incredible how many, not only games are still released on the Dreamcast, but also hardware as well. And I love this. A replacement is coming that really soups up one of the Dreamcast's most innovative features. We're getting a new VMU called the VM2.
This is like the VMU that I've always wanted. What do you think of it, Joe?
I think it looks really cool. Obviously, well, I say obviously, to kind of describe it, the main kind of thing of it straight away is it looks more modern, but we've got the nice kind of illuminated screen on there. We've got a nice backlit LCD screen, which I think just brings it into the 21st century straight away. It just modernizes it so much, but it's coming from Dream Mods, who have been doing quite a bit for the Dreamcast over the last couple of years. They've actually done a wireless Bluetooth Dreamcast controller before called the Dreamcom.
Oh yeah, I remember that.
Which they did in 2016. So this looks really, really high end. And, they've actually been working on this for quite a while, and you can go on their website and kind of see the development of it over the last kind of couple of months.
So I remember the VMU. It was like it promised a lot, but it didn't really kind of fully deliver on what I thought it would be when I was a kid. I thought it would be like, you could put it in and then you could take it out and play your games separately. This actually looks like it's got internal storage for mini games, which is 50 plus mini games as well that you can have on there.
Yeah,
it acts as a memory unit as well.
So there was a couple of mini games on the VMU. There was the Chow Garden game from was it Sonic Adventure 1 or 2? I can't remember which one it was on, but where it was essentially like a Tamagotchi, but for your chows from the game. I'm not too sure how many more games were on there, but yeah, like you say, there's going to be 50 to 60 mini games on this, as well as a higher resolution screen, micro SD slot, so it gives you obviously a much bigger capacity, obviously with the memory card kind of part for it. It's got PC connectivity on there and also like external charging, so it's not necessarily going to charge off the controller.
And a longer battery as well, which is pretty useful. Yeah.
Much longer.
Yeah,
battery.
That's to me is a main thing about this, because every time I turn my Dreamcast on, if I haven't used it for even a couple of weeks, beep, every time you turn that bloody noise.
We don't have any sort of like concrete kind of information of when this is going to come out. The guys over at Dream Mods have said, they probably will do a crowdfunding for it. Potentially looking at around $100 for it, £100, $100. So a little bit on the expensive side. I mean, how much do they cost now, VMUs?
I saw one in CEX for like 20 quid today.
Well, they're saying here on this article on their Dreamcast Junkyard that when you adjust for inflation today, the original VMU would have cost you $75 in 2022 money.
Oh, okay.
And I never really, when I played, I never really paid attention to the VMU. I had it in. And then I'd look down and I'd be like, oh, there's a virtual tennis logo on there.
I think most games only did that, didn't they?
Yeah,
most games only put like the game's
the logo or
there.
Some of the Resident Evil games put how much ammo you had left or how much health you had. But you just get so used to just going into your inventory and looking on the screen, like on your the actual game screen, than the VMU, like rather than like looking down at your controller all the time. How many bullets have I got? How much health have I got? So very, very cool concept. I always thought the VMU, but this VMU, the VM2, not the VMU2, sorry, the VM2 does look really interesting, and it does look really high end.
It'd be a nice little MP3 player, wouldn't it, as well?
Yeah, it would, but I'm not too sure if it's going to bring, much more to the experience, the Dreamcast experience.
I think it's just having something that, again, the battery life is going to be a lot better than relying on those CR2032 batteries that the original munched through. But also, I mean, I think you're right about the fact that that kind of looking away from the main screen method of gaming, it's never really worked, has it? And obviously the Wii U tried that as well, didn't it, with some games where you'd be playing on your TV and there'd be like a map or something on the controller.
Or like interactivity,
yeah, but I can't remember ever really. Again, I'd often play games and be like, oh, I forgot the map was down there. If you focused on the TV...
Yeah, the only use that I've seen that's been really nice on the Wii U was like when you played Wii U Sports and you put it down and there's like a golf ball on there or something. You're using it as kind of an extension, but that whole idea of having another unit that does another thing, this was really like the start of it, wasn't it?
Yeah, so very cool to see new hardware coming out for the Dreamcast over 20 years since it left the shelves. So we'll keep an eye on that, and hopefully we'll be able to get those before the end of the year.
One thing that they've mentioned is memory management. So you can connect it to a PC and share like backups and restores and stuff. I wonder if there's going to be sites with like people's saves on it, full saves of games or saves in certain spots and stuff.
There already is.
Yeah, and
there's quite a few Dreamcast community sites.
People kind of like will be able to restore it and manage them and add them in and stuff, which is pretty cool.
We can even load DLC from it too.
Awesome.
There are still some sites, that kind of archive the old Dreamcast sites from the early 2000s where you can download DLC to your VMU, which obviously if you can connect this via a USB cable, I imagine you can just kind of squirt that down the cable and then have that in Dreamcast. So definitely a few good uses for it. And I think having that SD card backup in there as well, you're not relying on that, battery to keep all your saves in that alive. So it looks a nice little addition actually. So we'll keep an eye on that story and we'll put everything we know so far in our show notes as well. Now, the Evercade, obviously a great little system, and we've done episodes all about the Evercade with the crew before, haven't we? Did one a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
I've got a little Evercade console, lots of fun. My father-in-law got one as well, actually, for Christmas after he played on mine. What I like about it is I generally play my Atari Lynx games on my Evercade, on the Lynx collection. Because I mentioned before that, my Lynx hasn't got the best screen anymore, and obviously got that problem again, batteries, something that's definitely improved over the last couple of decades. The Evercade, I think that's really its strengths, these amazing bundles that they've got, which generally have all been kind of console or arcade-based until now. But now we've finally got the first computer collection for the Evercade.
This is interesting because I think you're totally right there. The Evercade is all about having a group of games that have been selected for you that are really good in a collection form that you kind of load up and put in the cart. And it's like the opposite to RetroArch or something to me, like where people have thousands of these ROMs and stuff. Like this is legal. It's you've got a legal copy of the game. It's really interesting, and seeing that they've picked these C64 games, 14 of them. Have they picked some good titles, Dan?
That's the thing I like about the Evercade collection. I mean, obviously they're going to be limited by games that they can license, but it definitely feels more like they're a curated collection.
Yeah, that's exactly the word. Yeah, it's like created or chosen for you, and I don't know what it's like, but I know when you're looking at Netflix and you've got that endless doom scrolling list of stuff, and you can never pick, you can never pick a title. You're just scrolling forever, and I think having this small selection's really valuable actually, and it's a total different way of gaming, and I quite like it.
Yeah, so this is the C64 Collection Volume 1, so that would suggest there is more on the way for the Evercade that bundles together 14 Commodore 64 classics. There are some really popular games in here as well, but some of them are not quite the obvious ones as well, which I quite like. There are certain Commodore 64 games like, International Karate Plus. We've played them all a million times before. There are a few, slightly more obscure ones and some very well-known ones in here as well. I was quite pleased to see that Impossible Mission was on there.
Another visitor. Stay a while. Stay forever.
I thought you farted, Dan.
I was like, what's going on?
That was the Commodore 64 SID chip doing speech synthesis. That blew my mind when I heard that as a kid.
Yeah, man.
So Possible Missions on there. You got summer games and winter games. You got Jumpman on there as well. Obviously, summer games and winter games, kind of like, collections where you compete against each other, a bit like California games, that kind of thing. You got the Movie Monster game, Lee, where you take on the role of martial arts master Lee. I wonder who he's based on. You got a game called Marauder as well, Stormlord, Battle Valley, Alley Cat, which is a game I'd forgotten about actually, Streets Sports Baseball that I've never played before. So, I mean, again, it's not kind of the obvious Commodore 64 games that you've probably played 100 times before. It does feel more like a list that's kind of been selected, and especially having these kind of sports games in there as well. That kind of feels like on brand for the summer.
Yeah.
It kind of reminds me of going around friends' houses and playing California games.
Like some of these are multiplayer as well. So like the Verse console, the
VS.
Yeah, VS. Yeah, you'll be able to play like with your friends on these, which is pretty awesome. And some are single player as well, but it's good to have that option in there.
Yes, I just think it's really cool the fact that they're doing all these different collections for the Evercade as well. It's like it's not limited to a certain subset of gaming or a certain console or style. It kind of seems to be another variety.
Yeah,
of games that you can get on
they even had some of the modern remakes on a disc, like Mega Cat Studios and stuff like that. So having these old school ones and the arcades, it's really good, and I'm sure they'll do a great job of actually having them running because from what I've heard, stuff runs really well.
Yeah, so it is on their website right now. Looks like you can buy it now. The other way to buy links on there. The good thing about Evercade games as well, you can often get them in like Game and places like that, on the high street, which is quite cool. So it looks like it's available at the moment, so if you want to get hold of that. The Evercade Commodore 64 Collection Volume 1 looks like it's available now. Now, I think last week, when I mentioned that, we hadn't had any new patrons for a couple of weeks, it's quite nice to see a couple of people, because we appreciate right now, the whole world has gone a bit crazy, hasn't it? And, the cost of living crisis is on. We understand that a lot of people haven't got a lot of disposable income right now. But obviously, we do have a Patreon that we run for this show, really just to help us keep the lights on and make sure that we can keep bringing the show out each and every week. So we always hugely appreciate any support that we get. Been a bit dry on Patreon over the last couple of weeks, but we have got a few new ones this week. So we'll give them a mention in the Hall of Fame in just a moment. But of course, if you do want to back us on Patreon, you do get lots of perks as well. And I'm sure everyone's heard these by now, but we do have some special little perks exclusively for our Patreon. And the thing is, we're always looking at them too. So, if there's anything you kind of think you'd like to see from us, or any suggestions, or maybe something you think we could do on Patreon that would, maybe make you want to join the community, we're always open to ideas as well. We want to make it a really good experience for everyone, don't we?
Totally, and we're not going to do a calendar, but we will make it awesome. Like, there's a huge backlog as well now, actually, of I'd say back catalogue of episodes that we've done for the Retro Hour After Hours, and you could probably sit there and how many episodes are there now, Dan?
25 episodes of our Patrons Only podcast.
Oh, you can sit there for a whole day.
Oh wow, you could
listen to the Retro Hour After Hours. So that's a lot of extra content.
That. I've met people before who've truck drivers who go like across Europe and listen to our show for 2 or 3 days straight in their trucks.
Wow, that's crazy. Yeah. You could either watch a series of 24 or listen to the After Hours, all 25 episodes.
And then we also have our Retro Hour meetups, which are absolutely awesome. Everybody meeting up and chatting about all the systems, and it's a bit of an education, that is. And we also have an ad-free episode. So if you do back us, there's so many benefits.
Yeah, and also we give you extra patrons-only content on each week's show as well. Instead of adverts, you actually get 10-15 minutes extra stories each week too. So if you'd like to back us on Patreon, you get those perks, but obviously the main reason that you're doing it is just to make sure that we can keep bringing you this podcast each and every week. We've done it 6.5 years now. We couldn't do it, by paying for it ourselves. So we really appreciate any support that we get. And of course, for backing us on Patreon, you will get a mention in the most prestigious high score table in the world of retro gaming, and that is
Hall of Fame,
the Retro Hour Hall of Fame. And a big thank you to our latest supporters. Thanks so much to Pete Barfield,
Rob Claridge,
and Paul Duback,
who all backed us on Patreon over the last week. We massively appreciate your support. And if you'd like to join them and join our community, all the details to join us on Patreon are on our website at theretrohour.com. And if we get new patrons, you get to hear Ravi sing as well. Maybe that's why we get for a couple of weeks. Yeah.
I've not.
So our special guest, Paul Machacek, coming up, getting some inside stories from Rare in just a moment. But this is quite cool. Now, this seems to be a console that I've always been curious about, but actually I seem to be reading quite a bit about over the last couple of months. And this is the 3DO M2. Now, of course, we had the 3DO console from the 3DO company. We've done episodes all about that before, where Trip Hawkins on talking about it, and RJ Michael. If you want to check those episodes out, we did those a couple of years ago. I've always been interested in the 3DO because it was a system that when I was a kid, I remember that coming out. What was it, like $600? I think that got released.
$700, something like that. In 93?
Yes. So way out of the price of most average gamers. Didn't get to play one until much later. I got my 3DO probably in around 2009. Interesting system, and it was kind of that weird era between the Mega Drive and the Super Nintendo and the PlayStation, when we got all these consoles that were around for a couple of months and then they vanished. But there was meant to be a successor to the 3DO that was kind of on par, if not a bit more powerful than the PlayStation, called the M2, that was set to be released in 1997. But, because 3DO wasn't doing that well, and by then PlayStation pretty much completely owned the market, it got cancelled. But recently, there have been not only a couple of these prototypes that have sold on eBay for ridiculous prices, but if you've ever been interested in the very small catalogue of 3DO M2 games, turns out now you can play all 5 of them using MAME.
Now, that's really interesting that you say 5, because I'm reading here that a magazine reported in 1997, that's Ultra Game Players, that there were nearly 80 games that were in development for the M2. So maybe those 5 have been out there, but who knows what could come in the future. We know what happens with leaks.
So some of them were arcade games. So like Evil Knight is one of the 5, but that was an arcade released game. It was a
Konami, wasn't it?
Konami light gun game, which actually is a game I absolutely loved playing as a kid in the local arcade. And it wasn't until only a couple of years ago that I literally went through an entire list of every single light gun arcade game that ever came out to try and find what game it was, because I didn't know its name. And now here it is being emulated on the M2.
So you're the only one of us who's actually played an M2 then, Joe?
It wasn't the M2, it was the arcade game.
But that was the M2 hardware in that arcade.
Oh wow. Okay.
Yeah.
That's awesome. I was going to say it was an arcade called Smiling Sam's in Nottingham, if anybody can remember that. But yeah, it's one of these really unheard of games, and there's hardly any YouTube footage of it. So to see it here on this video, I'm sat here quietly having my mind blown right now.
Well, the actual M2 products, I mean, there was 2 prototype home consoles that were released, and then the motherboard was actually licensed to Konami, who put it into an arcade system, which would have been the one that you played. And they had 5 games that they made for it. But apparently, because it was running off CD, so you've got an arcade machine running off a CD-ROM, you got those long load times, and apparently the failure rate was quite high as well. And then after that, the M2 was used in ATM bank machines, and in Japan in a coffee vending machine. It was where it ultimately ended up. So
shoot the zombies to get a latte.
Yeah. I'm not sure whether you can emulate a coffee machine using this MAME emulator, but it is quite good. Now, apparently, if you want to get hold of this, you can run it on MAME now, and I'll put the links in the show notes as well. And we talked about this recently, a YouTube channel called Video Game Esoterica, who actually managed to get hold of a few previously unseen games. I think these are these 5 that, previously we knew about, but no one had them. And actually did a video. Actually, I think there's 20 games he shows in his video that are just kind of previews of it. So it kind of looks like now this stuff is getting out there as well. But you do need quite a beefy PC, because apparently this is not that optimized. And if you want to get them running at speeds that are kind of playable, you're going to need quite a high end PC to do it.
It's probably early days, right? Just starting that. But the fact that this is actually being emulated and can be put in the hands of people that don't have it, I think that's pretty awesome. And, they might optimize it over time and stuff. I guess there's how had they done it? They probably reversed engineered it, or referenced the machines that are out there. Must be a tough thing to do.
Yeah, see, there are prototype consoles out there. I think one went on eBay for about $5,000 a couple of weeks ago. So, whether someone got one of those and just kind of dumped the ROMs, and emulated it, or it might be the Konami arcade units, of which, there were some out there. So again, though, it's just, systems that we read so much about. And I remember watching the tech demos of the M2, and you can still see these on YouTube. And I'm not sure if this was ever a finished game or whether it's in any kind of playable state. The one that always sticks out in my mind, and I don't know if you guys have seen it, is there was it looked a bit like a first-person shooter, fully 3D rendered, and it had kind of this morphing character, that came out the wall. Reminded me a bit, do you remember the Michael J. Fox movie, The Frighteners?
Yeah.
Yeah, it looked a bit like that. So kind of all monsters are coming out of the wall and everything and out the floor. And I always remember thinking that looked incredible. I don't know if it ever saw the light of day, but that's always, ever since I saw that, I've been really keen to play on a 3DO M2. So being able to actually sample a bit of the library, I think, is really cool on MAME.
And it does look so on par with PlayStation graphics and stuff when you're seeing this. And it's a pretty awesome piece of history, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. So that is available to play on MAME right now. Now, while we're talking about really cool things that the retro community have done, what about this little video that you need to watch? This is a Nintendo fan who's made a tiny portable Super Nintendo and a TV for the 16-bit fan on the go.
Yeah, so this is called the SF1 Mini, and it's the Super Famicom. But the way that he's done it, I'm going to butcher this pronunciation, is he recently showed a kit which was called the Cho Famitsuku DIY kit, basically. And it was a way of doing the Super Family computer. And that was the Super Famicom. And it's kind of recreated in this little DIY kit form, but you need to do some changes and adjustments. Now, this machine, he's done an absolutely beautiful job of it. What do you guys think of it?
I think it looks really, really cool. The fact that this has been made by a fan, it looks like a full retail product. The kind of end result, it really reminds me of those mini Astro Cities that Sega put out last year, where it's the all-in-one kind of arcade unit. This would just be the next step in mini console development, where it comes with a mini CRT as well. Obviously, it isn't a CRT, but the style of it, I think it looks really, really cool. The way he's got it running, got all the innards and everything in there, I think is really cool. And then I just think it looks really, really awesome with the cartridge in the top.
I'm sure. Didn't you remember there were these TVs back in the days, CRTs that did have consoles built into, like a kind of crossover. I remember.
There's a GameCube one, wasn't there?
There's the Sharp. Oh, what's it called?
The Mega PC or something? No, that was the PC crossover.
Screaming at me right now, but there was I don't think it came out in the UK, but in Japan and America, the Sharp something, and it was a TV which had an NES built into it.
Yeah, and this really reminds me of that.
And it had the drop-down panel at the bottom, and the controllers pulled out very similar to the Vectrex, and they had the cartridge slot there and stuff like that. So yeah, it is really, really similar to that, that kind of style. But obviously, this is just, you can't use it as a normal TV or anything like that. But the way he's done it, it just looks so smart. It just looks really clean, doesn't it?
Yeah, he's basically got this little LCD monitor. He's 3D printed the casing around it, and he's built in a HDMI converter as well. I can't say his name because it's in Japanese, so it's quite hard to actually say. But yeah, it looks fantastic with this video, and the fact that this DIY kit can be converted into this, and I guess he could probably release all the files publicly as a kind of 3D printing thing so people can do it themselves. It does look really compact and awesome.
Yeah, I love the fact as well that he's got stereo sound in there. I mean, it looks like, imagine a small 5 to 6 inch CRT, but obviously it's a flat screen in there, an LCD, with a couple of controller ports underneath it. You put the cartridge in the top of it, and, he's got a picture here, the thumbnail on YouTube, of the Super Nintendo controller next to it, which is about half the height of the screen, isn't it? So it really is a portable. I mean, the entire thing probably looks about the size of a GameCube.
Yeah,
with a screen in the front. So really it means you can have a portable Super Nintendo. And it's got some kind of, nice mod cons on there as well. Uses a USB-C for power.
Yeah, which means you can probably use a little battery pack and add it on, and then it is, truly portable.
You just crank that out on the train or on the plane.
Yeah, totally.
I really want one now. The looks you would get. So if you want to check out that video, it just constantly amazes me, the genius people that we have in the retro community and the ingenuity that they come up with. These projects
if you do kind of pull that out, you're going to have to blow in the cart really loud. So everyone looks around and thinks, what's he doing? And then put it in.
Yeah, so very, very cool. We'll link up that video and everything else we talked about, all the stories. You don't have to Google around for them. You'll find them all in your podcast app or in our show notes at theretrohour.com. Right, then next we're going to get some inside stories from Rare with our special guest, Paul Machacek, next on the Retro Hour podcast.
You're listening to the Retro Hour podcast, and we're here with Paul Machacek from Rare. How are you doing, Paul?
I'm doing great. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Awesome. It's great to have you on. And it's kind of like going back, what was your first video game experience?
I was getting into computers in the very early 80s. The oldest game that I can think I played was probably something like Scramble and Defender on a BBC Micro. But I had access to Research Machines 380Z and I think the 480Z prior to that. And I was programming them kind of before I'd actually played a game, which is probably weird. And I was like 12.
That's interesting. That's interesting because it's usually the other way around. You find somebody plays a game and then they think, oh, how can I make this myself? So how did that come about? Was it just, through sheer interest of just the amazement of a computer, or was it a friend who got you into it or something?
I'll be honest with you, I was very lucky. I went to a very good school and it was well resourced. And right back in the early 80s, most schools kind of didn't have computers. And we had a whole computer room. And we had two masters at the school. One was a maths master and the other was a physics master. They'd both been co-opted into teaching computer programming. The thing was, they had been co-opted not because they had been trained to teach computer programming, but because they had computers at home and had an interest. And they were the only people in the school who knew anything about computers. So the school had a computer room which was largely populated with these research machines devices which really didn't play video games, hence why I was learning to code before I saw a game, really. And there was a small group of probably about 10 or 15 people in the class. And there was myself and one other lad that were just complete geeks, and we'd taught ourselves assembly language when we were like 12 or 13 years old. And our teacher didn't want to ask us any questions. He'd rather ask all the people that weren't going to correct him when he gave us false information. So I sat there quietly most of the time, and then I got on with my own project. It was a weird experience. There was no formal learning at that age. You could go to uni, obviously, and do computer software engineering courses. But when you're 12 at school and you're still several years away from your O-levels, which is what we called GCSEs back then, no one really knew. If you were older than a teenager, you had no idea what you were doing with a computer. So myself and another lad just got on with it, basically, and we taught ourselves at home.
Well, I heard you learn assembler on an Oric 1 as well.
Yeah.
What did you think of that system, and how did you get a hold of it? Because it was kind of like a Spectrum alternative, wasn't it?
Yeah.
By Tangerine Computers.
I know. Look, it was completely a practical thing at the time. I desperately wanted a computer at home because I was stifled by the short, like, hour-long windows I could get in the computer room at school. And my housemaster, who was a bit of a Luddite, kept trying to ban me from the computer room because I spent too much time in there rather than doing sensible things like learning about Henry VIII, which would have been hugely useful in my future career, I thought. So I ignored him. And I saved up my pennies. It was literally pocket money. And I got to a point when I can afford a computer. And the Oric had just come out. And I do appreciate the Spectrum was probably, in hindsight, the better bet. But the Oric had what looked like a better keyboard. I just couldn't imagine myself. I'd played on a Spectrum by that point, and I couldn't imagine myself trying to write a game in assembly language on those rubber keys. I have now just alienated a whole bunch of people my age.
We've had so many programmers on that said, they were developing Spectrum games on other systems just because of the keyboard, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a perfectly fine argument. The Oric machines, were there many games out for those?
There were a few. I mean, it wasn't massively lived. I mean, the original Oric 1 lasted a little while. I think Tangerine were having a lot of, business troubles, financial troubles. They brought out the Atmos, which looked much better. It looked more professional. I mean, it's all relative. But if you go back then, it actually looked like it had a proper keyboard on it. It was, in many ways, I think it was effectively the same thing inside. 6502, similar amount of RAM, usual stuff back then for an 8-bit computer. But I wasn't focused on... I think I had one game. I had a game called Xenon 1, which I absolutely loved. It only had about 4 levels. It was a space shooter. And I absolutely loved playing it. And you had this sort of big green furry alien that would fly around the screen. You'd shoot it and it would turn into 4 smaller furry aliens, and you shot them, and I can't remember what happened after that. It was 40 years ago. But you know what? I've just got a technical edge. My dad was very technical, and I very quickly... It was that thing back then, and I think we missed this. Ever since the 80s ended, I think we really missed this. You could buy a machine, take it home, switch it on, it would come on instantly, and there'd be this flashing, inviting cursor there. And you could type an instruction from the book that came with it, and it would do something immediately. And if you put a line number in front of it, it would remember that instruction. And you could write several of these, and suddenly you had code. And a whole generation of people learned to code that way. And, it triggered the video game industry. Loads of studios in the UK, including Rare, including Codemasters just down the road, it was just incredibly inviting to do that. Obviously, some of us very quickly got to the point with the basic language most of these things came with, where we realized that whilst they were very easy to put things on the screen, it was very limiting in terms of performance. And at that point, you then go into the murky world of hexadecimal numbers and poking things into memory and creating what we termed at the time machine code.
From that point, how did you kind of like, at what point did you think like, you know what, this could be a career? Did that ever kind of cross your mind, or were you just kind of going with the flow?
So this was it. You're a young kid. You're completely hooked on trying to learn how to write computer code at a very low level. And when I say low level, I actually had no tools on the Oric. What I was doing was I had a book with a 6502 instruction set in it and what those instructions translated to in terms of hex numbers. And I had pretty much nothing else. There were a few small snippet examples of code and I knew nothing else. So what I did was I'd write some instructions out on a piece of paper, draw lines showing the algorithm and where the jumps went. I would then sit there laboriously converting them into hex, copy those hex numbers into a little basic program that wrote them into memory, and then ran it. And nothing would happen because it was a very small program and it didn't do much. But eventually I sort of worked out how it worked. And I had the Oric for about a year and a half. And I was just, I was writing short little programs this way and getting stuff on screen. But it was limiting in terms of the scope of what I could do. And then the Amstrad CPC came out. And that was a whole other ballgame. And I wanted to buy this, but I had limited pocket money funds. So my dad managed to sell my Oric and get me the Amstrad on the same day. And very quickly after that, I got an assembler, a little dev package called Maxam, which was on a ROM cartridge that you'd plugged in the back of the CPC. And you could boot straight into a text editor, save out your source code files, assemble it and run it. And I was off. Although, admittedly, a bit more slowly initially because I just jumped from 6502 to Z80 processor. So I had to learn another processor architecture, again, with extremely minimal help. But I was off at that point, and it was amazing. I just loved creating stuff. And so the focus was on writing software. And I did more and more, and the projects I was doing were getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And then eventually I just went, well, what am I actually going to do with this skill? And I thought, well, I have played some games. I'll write a small game. So I wrote a game. And then, you're a young teen and you've written a game, what do? Well, you don't tell your parents. What you do is you start contacting people in London and near Reading and a bunch of other people. And when I say contacting, we didn't exactly have the internet in the early mid-80s. So I was putting audio cassettes with my game on and pleading letters I typed up carefully into jiffy bags and sending them off with my pocket money to publishers. And some of them ignored me. Some may have got lost in the post, and some of them responded. And I ended up sitting in publishers' offices, 15 years old, whatever. My parents had no idea where I was. I was reading contracts. I was signing contracts. I'm not a lawyer. I was making up as I was going along.
Oh, wow.
That's pretty amazing. I was just wondering, were you like a fan of the precursor to Rare as well, Ultimate Play the game? And did you play any like Ultimate titles, and were they inspiration to the stuff that you were doing?
So this is probably a fairly strained analogy, but when I was growing up, there was the concept of your Kennedy moment. You remember exactly where you were when you heard that JFK got shot. Well, as I say, this is about to be a strained analogy. I remember walking into my sixth form study, which I shared with a friend. I might have been in the lowest sixth form at the time, so about 17. And we had a Spectrum in there and a TV. And he was sitting there playing a game, and I looked at it, and I was just gobsmacked. My mouth dropped open, and I said, "Is that the new Ultimate game?" And it was Nightlaw, which obviously didn't look like anything else at the time. I know Ant Attack had been out prior to that, isometric and all, but Nightlaw was just wow. Okay, and for me, that was a bit of a Kennedy moment. I remember exactly where I was when I saw that game, and I was already a massive fan of Ultimate. Huge, I played Saberwolf to death and a few others, and then some of the other games that came out. Obviously Alienate was like a reskinned thing, and I love that. Nightshade, I thought going to the scrolling isometric was great. And the thing is that I said that I'd been approaching publishers and getting games published. I'd had a few games published by the time I joined Rare, a couple of years after I left school, so 3 years after this Nightlaw incident actually. And All of these publishers were offering me jobs. You know, I was coming out of the blue with a finished game saying, "Could you publish this, please?" And they were looking at me going, "Do you want a job?" And I was sort of quietly, privately saying to them, politely saying to them, "Well, if you don't mind, not at this time." But what I was actually saying was, I don't want to work for anybody else at all. I wanted to do my own stuff, right? But
All right.
I had at the back of my mind that if I was ever going to work with anybody, it would be Ultimate, because no one else was good enough. And I'm sorry if I've just offended a ton of people, but to me, at that time, Ultimate stood out. Okay, I know there was loads of other great stuff out there, but I just thought that they did a block of games, basically from Attic Attack up to, I might include Pentagram, maybe Gunfight Pentagram era. That body of work in that era, and it was just absolutely stunning. And lo and behold, I ended up working at Rare.
So how did that kind of come about? So you're like, what, you're 20, like kind of 17 to 20, doing freelance work, you know, sending jiffy bags and stuff, which I absolutely love, but turning down roles and stuff, which is just crazy. Like I love that confidence and stuff as well. How did you then end up with Rare? How did that happen? Because obviously at that point it's kind of like like you say, not so much a dream job, but it's in the back of your mind, like that'd be really cool. How did that come about?
Yeah, that's actually an interesting story. So it's funny that you describe it like that. I might seem confident these days. I'm old and grumpy now, but back then I was actually extremely shy, and I was probably socially awkward, I guess. That's maybe a reason why I like staring at computer screens for a long time. Or the flip side is maybe I was socially awkward because I stared at computer screens for a long time. I don't know. So I'd been doing all this work. I was burning the midnight oil at home. My parents had no idea what I was doing. I spent several years hiding in my bedroom, and occasionally they'd slip a sandwich past the door or something, you know. And, there were nights I would get into a furious programming session, and I keep going. I had no idea what was going on around me. And then I suddenly hear the birds singing. I'd look around and it was daylight again. I'd just been up all night without realizing it. So what happened was, I wasn't achieving any massive success. My games were going out, but nothing was going sort of ballistic or anything. And I was getting a bit down about that. So if you thought me putting jiffy bags out when I was 12 or 14 or whatever was a bit of a leap for your average young teen, I then did something completely random. I wrote to a magazine letters page and basically said, "I'm starting a studio. Who wants to join me?" And I put my parent. We didn't have cell phones back then, so I put our house landline phone number in this advert. In this letter, and I sent it off. I posted it. I remember standing at the post box, going, "Here goes," and I threw it in. And then my parents started getting a lot of weird and random phone calls from a bunch of very bizarre people, and they were really dodgy phone calls. And I hadn't been getting a lot of phone calls up until that point. My mum kept coming up to me and said, "There's somebody on the phone for you, and he sounds a bit odd." And I go down and quickly weeded out, and most of them were, I'm trying not to say the word crazy. I'm sure they were lovely human beings. Anyway.
Eccentrics, yeah.
Eccentrics. Yeah. Let's go with eccentrics, yes. And I'll be honest with you, my mum would have absolutely killed me if she knew I was doing any of the stuff I've just admitted to. And she's still around, so if she ever hears this podcast, I'm a bit older now. She can't tell me off at my current, well, she might. And then one day I got a phone call from somebody called John. And he said something, and he sounded less crazy than, less, what was the word we agreed on?
Eccentric.
Eccentric. He sounded less eccentric than the other eccentric, lovely folk, who I hope never hear this recording. And he said a couple of things to me, and I stopped him. He actually said his full name, and I haven't said that yet. And I stopped him. I said, "Sorry, who are you?" And he said, "I'm John Rittman. I wrote Batman for Ocean." And I went, this is the bit where I'm trying not to swear. So think of a word I might say after O.
Mm-hmm. Blimey.
Yes, okay, I'll go with the English thing. Oh, blimey, Jolly Roger, Jolly Hockey Sticks, it's John Rittman. And I suddenly felt incredibly embarrassed because I knew, obviously, who John Rittman was, but the penny hadn't dropped when he first said his name. And he said, I can't remember how the conversation went, but he says, "You're starting a studio." I went, yeah. And long story short, we became friends. I remember he lived in North London, I was South West London. He came over one day we sat in my room. I showed him something I was working on at the time, which did eventually get released, but it was in a doggy state. So I felt really embarrassed to show it to him at the time. It had a really, really slow, clunky engine in it, and everything juddered on the screen. But we had a chat and everything, and he didn't hate me. And we became friends. And then, I started visiting him in London, and he introduced me to Bernie Drummond, who did all the art for their games. I have to say at this point, very sadly, obviously, I'd like to mention that Bernie did actually pass away a few months ago.
Yeah.
Incredibly, incredibly talented guy. And I really, really enjoyed working with him. And, we only worked on one project together. And, that was in 1987. So going back a bit. But what ended up happening was I really, really wanted to write an isometric game because I was just, Night Law was my thing. And all my previous games, I'd done everything on. I designed them. I wrote the software. I had no artist, no other help. So I did all the audio. I did all the art myself. And suddenly I was introduced to an artist and eventually Guy Stevens, who did John's audio as well, all of his music. And he got to a point where I just said, look, I want to write an isometric game. And John said, look, I haven't got enough work for these two chaps. Why don't they help you? So we did a deal. And I ended up writing a game called Superhero, which took about a year. Which was a 3D isometric game where I sort of married up the puzzle static room isometric thing of Night Law. But when you came out of the rooms, there were scrolling corridors like Nightshade. I tried to do the two things, and I was incredibly proud of it by the time I'd finished. It was just a major technological achievement for me. Plus, it looked and sounded awesome because of what Bernie and Guy did. I was gobsmacked. Every time Bernie sent me a disc through the post, I was just, wow. Absolutely, wow, everything. I loved it, and, it's possible some of them were cast off things that they'd rejected from head over heels, which they were writing at the time. First time I went to John's house to meet Bernie, John was showing me head over heels. He was writing it. They were writing it at the time.
I was wondering, you created titles for the Spectrum and Amstrad CPC. When, the Game Boy came around, was it kind of easy to jump into the Game Boy world? And when you first started with Rare, what was there a kind of established connection with the Game Boy already, or had it not come out by then?
There was no such thing as the Game Boy when I joined Rare. Okay, long story short, I took Superhero to Codemasters, had a meeting with the Darling Brothers, they published it. Mm-hmm. While we were going through the pre-publishing stuff, John said to me, oh, by the way, because he knew Tim and Chris Stamper at Rare, he said to me, I'm going up to Rare. Do you want to come with me? I ended up going up to North London on the train, jumped in John's car. Bernie was there. We all went up to Rare. I met the Stampers, met some other people, showed them Superhero, which was finished at this point. They interviewed me. I think John put in a good word for me. They gave me a job. That was July 1988 when I started. Okay.
Yeah.
When I first started, they had an arcade board called the RAS board, which was a Z80 based system. So I came straight off writing on Spectrums and Amstrad CPCs, all Z80. Went straight onto the RAS board, no problem at all. Just settling down with the new dev tools, blah, blah, blah. Right. We only did some prototypical work and mucking about on that. And then very quickly, I got given a game on the Nintendo NES. So I had to jump back to 6502 and I had to quickly relearn that again. I hadn't done it in about 5 years, okay? Did a couple of games, Super Off-Road and Beetlejuice with Kev Bayliss doing all the artwork and Dave Wise on the audio, as usual back then. And then we switched to Game Boy. There's an interesting story about the Game Boy. So the Game Boy came out in 1989. So I'd been I can't remember, it was unveiled at the CES show, the Consumer Electronics Show, which is where video games were all showed off at that point before E3 came along in the mid-90s. And there used to be 2 CESs a year. These days there's only one in January, but there used to be the winter and the summer CES. So I can't remember which one it was, but Tim Stamper had this mad idea that we should try and make a handheld machine out of this arcade board, the RAS board. Now you can imagine a great big circuit board that goes into an arcade machine.
Yeah, like a jammer thing or something.
Yeah. And Tim said, let's get it into the palm of your hand. And we're looking at him like, what? So he bought a vacuum forming machine. And he'd also brought back a little 3-inch colour portable TV from Japan when he'd been out there on holiday or something. And we cannibalised it. And long story short, Pete Cox, who's still at Rare today, soldered all the chips together, and they're sort of free floating. There was no circuit board. It was highly unreliable. We shoved it into a case. It was quite large, but in the palm of your hand. Ran it off a bunch of AA batteries, which probably only lasted about 5 minutes before the arcade board killed them. And then I wrote the demo software for it. And then we did what you would do at this point. You would give it a name, and we called it the Playboy. Because we thought that was a non-litigious and fun name to call our great big handheld gaming rig that could play an arcade game for less than 5 minutes on your batteries. And then Tim went off to the CES show with it. And you got to bear in mind, back then, we lived in the days where there was no internet. We really didn't have cell phones properly back then. The only communication was a fax machine, or if you wanted to make a transatlantic phone call, you had to book it with the telecom company first, okay? So Tim went off to CES for a week, came back. We had no idea what was going on. And he said, I'm going to show this to Nintendo. We said to him, did you show it to Nintendo? He said, no. They seem to have released this funny little thing with a blurry green-grey screen. What's it called? It's called the Game Boy. And I'll tell you what, we were initially disappointed, but wow, what a success. And they bundled it with the best game in the world ever to release that machine with. I mean, that brought video gaming out of people's houses, out of people's bedrooms. Yeah. People took that into schools and offices, and it was known as the funny little machine that played the block game. And some of those people then went out and actually exploited it by buying more cartridges. Utterly incredible. Yeah. So Kevin and I had just done a couple of NES games. We got onto Game Boy for a reason I can come back to if you want me to in a minute. But to be honest with you, the Game Boy was a hybrid between what I'd done on Spectrum and Amstrad and what I'd done on NES, because the Game Boy architecturally was very similar to the NES. It had a character map screen, even more limited palettes, obviously, pretty much the same sound chip. I mean, it was architecturally, it was very, very similar. And the only real significant difference from an engineering point of view was the processor was Z80 again, instead of the 6502 clone that was in the NES. And I was straight back into my comfort zone moving to Game Boy on Z80 because I'd written a ton of games in Z80 and published them on home computers a few years earlier. So actually transition to Game Boy was dead easy. And the story I've got around that, if you're interested.
Tell us about that. How did that transition? How did you become the Game Boy guy?
Okay, so I have to be careful here because I might upset somebody, two people, basically. So the vast majority of stuff that was happening at Rare back in the late 80s and early 90s was done by people actually in the Twycross studio. However, there were one or two people outside Rare that were also sort of doing things for Rare, and some of those were released and some were not. And while Kev and I were working on Super Off-Road and then Beetlejuice on the NES, there was a wrestling game that was happening out of house. And we'd heard on the grapevine it wasn't going spectacularly well. And we just finished Beetlejuice, and this project was about 9 months in, is my recollection. And basically, Tim came to Kev and I and said, look, do you know what's going on with that game? And we said no. And he said, look, would you pick it up? And my response to Tim was, well, if it's not going that well, I've never looked at anyone else's code before, and I'm terrified. I just don't want to do that. But you're telling me it's not going very well in the first place. Would it not just be easier if you wanted us to take this game in-house just to start again? And he agreed. And then I asked the fateful question. I said, what is the deadline? And Tim said Saturday. I didn't need to ask which Saturday. And this was like a Monday, I think, we were having the conversation. And before I got a chance to say, are you sure? He said, look, if you can do it in 3 months, we think we can stall the publisher, which was Acclaim. We think we can stall Acclaim that long. Bearing in mind, this thing, as far as Acclaim was concerned, had already been in production for like 9 months at this point.
And you're suddenly restarting it 5 days before, yeah.
Yeah, pretty much, yeah, as you do. And Tim agreed. So Kev and I burnt the midnight oil, and we immediately jumped onto this system that we'd never seen architecturally before. I picked up a Game Boy manual and started staring at it, trying to work out what it did. And simply because of the sheer familiarity between the similarity of hardware architecture between the Game Boy and the NES and my Z80 experience, I just dived straight into it and we wrote a game. The only thing I did not write was we had on the NES we had what was known as the tune routine. It was the music driver which Chris Stamper had originally written, and all of the NES games used the same driver. Okay, and somebody, and I don't remember who it was. It might have been Chris Stamper. It might have been Chris Sutherland. I just don't remember who it was. Somebody did a Z80 version of it and gave it to me, and it was the only code in that game I didn't write. Everything else I coded. Kev did all the artwork. Dave did all the audio in it. And we wrote WWF Superstars in 3 months and 1 week, exactly. I'll be honest with you, we worked extremely long hours to do that. We banged it out and it sold 400,000 copies. We were not hated at that point.
Amazing.
And that had a 2-player link option as well, didn't it? Which was quite cool for a wrestling title.
Yeah, that was fun because that was a bit of a technical challenge. I'd never had to... You got to bear in mind that we're talking about extremely low-level systems in those days. You didn't have anything where there was an operating system and an API that you could boot into and use. There was nothing. What you do is there is an address in memory where the processor starts running instructions as soon as you switch it on, and the very first instruction at that address is whatever you, the programmer, we didn't call ourselves software engineers, the computer programmer at Rare, you would put, or anybody else, you would put instructions into memory, and that's what would run. There was nothing else there. So when it came to doing the serial comms, you pretty much had to hard code it yourself. There was incredibly low level support from the hardware for sending bytes between two machines, and it got a bit more complicated when they brought out the 4-way adapter as well. And that was a pain, because you're pushing the hardware, and you then got to have this sort of interrupt driven communication system that all the other things you're doing can't trip over. It needs to be nicely timed. And even though you're not really sending much information for a 2-player wrestling game, it was still a bit of a nuisance when you're trying to rush through a project in the time frame and under the circumstances I've described, and you've never written a serial communication system before. But hey, we got through it, and it didn't go horribly wrong.
Sounds very don't know how to describe it, kind of guerrilla style, like just kind of having to do it yourself with no kind of real development kits and stuff like that. Like, was there much of a relationship between Nintendo and Rare at this point, or were you guys just, like you say, just ripping stuff apart and figuring it out for yourself?
The famous story was that Tim and Chris approached Nintendo originally when Rare was first set up in 85. Rare was set up in 85. I don't remember exactly when they approached them and said, can we develop for you? And at that time, no Western studio, Nintendo didn't work with anybody outside Japan, is my understanding. And they basically looked at Tim and Chris. They had no idea about the success of Ultimate back in the UK because Nintendo didn't have a footprint here. So they basically said, no, go away. Or a very polite Japanese version of that. So Chris took a NES apart and looked at it, and he was able to reverse engineer it. He worked out it was a 6502 chip. He could work out what the other chips were around it, and he quickly worked out what it was. And then he wrote a game. And he took this finished game back to Nintendo and said, here you go. This is what we did without an instruction manual or support from you. And they were so impressed, Rare became the very first Western studio that Nintendo would work with. Okay. So Rare had already released a number of games on the NES by the time I joined in the summer of 88. And we continued to do so. I was employee number 17 at Rare. And out of the previous 16 people, 7 of them were computer programmers. So by the time I joined and I got a game, that meant each programmer had one game. So 17 employees, 8 computer programmers, that means 8 games were in production, and they were all for the NES. And most of them were for other people's IP. We weren't doing a lot of original stuff back then. There was a lot of bread and butter games. Just write a game quick, get it out there, bring some money in, rinse and repeat.
I was going to say, like, LGN. What were they like? What was their attitude and relationship with Rare like? Because I remember a lot of the LGN titles had really good, like, David Wise music put over the top of it and stuff.
Yeah. LGN's not there anymore, are they? Who am I going to upset?
No.
We were not fans. You work with people. They're your publisher. Look, 30 plus years have gone past. The dust has settled, I guess. There are some publishers that we have worked with that were just a complete ball ache. I would come in. I'll give you an example. This was an LJN one, but I can say this of some other publishers without naming them right now. We would everybody, we were UK based, right? So everybody we worked with was either Nintendo in Japan, Nintendo in America, or publishers, Acclaim, LJN in America, right? None of the phone calls that we ever had between Rare and anybody we were working with were in our time zone. And we'd get a lot of communications that would come in on fax overnight. So a fax machine was something that it would just banged out text down a phone line and print it out. So you come in the morning and there'd be this long printout on a rolled up piece of paper with all of the feedback from the publisher going, oh, could you make your game a bit better? And I remember coming in one morning, and we get a bit jaded about it at this point because it was a lot of nonsense. I remember coming in one morning and I forget, it was one of the NES games I wrote with Kev. In fact, it must have been Beetlejuice because that was published by LJN. Super Off-Road was Trade West. So I remember coming in one morning. There was a long list of, I'm doing quote marks. I'm doing air quote marks in front of you right now. Improvements. And it was from some middle manager. I still remember his name. I'm not going to tell you who it is. I do not like this guy to this day. And in amongst them, this was typical. He said, could you change the background color of the title page from red to blue or from blue to red? Because it will make the game better. And I read this out aloud to a couple of people. I think Kev might have been there. I don't know. I read it to Tim. Oh, he'd already read it. And we're just looking at each other going, what a load of, oh, blimey. This is where I would swear profusely. What a load of complete, utter, blah, 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 blah. Rubbish, go away. And we knew what was going on. What was happening was this person was simply going back up his management chain saying, hey, the game was rubbish, but I've made it better. Thanks. We just could not wait to get away from doing other people's IP and working with those publishers in that way. I'll be completely honest with you. And, Battletoads was the first, there have been some other individual games, things like Snake, Rattle and Roll. I know there were odd games which were just completely Rare created and, write a game internally. We can self-fund it. Won't take too long. Take it to a publisher when it's finished. But Battletoads was the first time that a franchise, a real tangible thing that Rare would own to get us away from this business model, was created. And we just wanted to get away from that. It was just a lot of nonsense. We wrote a lot of games and just dealing with some of these people was a bit of a pain. The really contentious one for me was actually at the end of Super Off-Road. Sorry, if I'm rambling, I don't know how much time you folks have got. At the end of Super Off-Road on the NES, it was the first full game I'd written for Rare. I finished it. John Rittman was there. We opened a bottle of champagne. But I remember we got feedback from Trade West, particularly from the developer, saying they'd seen the game and they didn't like it. And they were so annoyed about it that they put the two guys that had written the arcade one on a plane and flew them over. And I ended up sitting in a barn in a meeting room with these two guys one side of the table and myself and Tim and Chris Stamper on the other side of the table. And we had a real contentious meeting for about 2 hours. And we were getting nowhere. Basically, they didn't understand why it looked as bad as it did in their opinion, or it sounded as bad as it did in their opinion, or everything else, right? They just hated it. And we just couldn't get anywhere with them. And then the penny dropped. And I just turned to Tim and Chris and I just went, hang on a sec. And I started asking these two guys questions about the arcade board that they'd written the game on, because they had written on an arcade board, which, as you can imagine, was way more powerful than an S. And I just sat there and quietly listened. And I asked them about the hardware, the screen architecture and the audio and how much RAM it had and all this sort of stuff and, the processor. And at the end of it, I basically said to them, what you just described is architecturally very similar to the NES. It's just that all the numbers on the NES are smaller. I've got less processing power. I've got less RAM. I've got far fewer characters on screen. I've got far fewer palettes. I've got far fewer this. I've got far fewer that. And I made this little speech for about 3 or 4 minutes about why the NES, brilliant machine, but why it simply wasn't anywhere near as powerful as an arcade board. And they were quietly sitting there looking at me. And I stopped. And one of them just said to me, did you write that on that machine? Anyway, afterwards, we went away happy and jolly. Tim shook my hand, and they were extremely happy to go back to Trade West and say that the NES game was absolutely fantastic and they loved it suddenly. But, when I pointed out that the entire character bank on a NES only filled a quarter of the screen if you used the characters once, and so we had to repeat the characters, otherwise you're going to get 3/4 of the screen full of black space. I don't know. And I work with some incredibly talented people. Everybody was pushing the hardware as much as we could. And then, we had this sort of feedback from people that were critiquing what we were doing, either badly or not understanding what we were doing. And it's like, really? We're having to deal with these people? I didn't say Muppets there. I said people.
So essentially, you just had to explain to them the architectural differences between an arcade board and an NES for them to really understand it.
Yeah. They were expecting me to write an arcade game, and I did, on a NES, though.
Yeah, exactly. A lot less powerful. So,
and I'll tell you, I just want to add to that. Tim and Chris Stamper were doing arcade games in the very late 70s, early 80s, and then they transitioned onto the Spectrum, set up Ashby Computers and Graphics. Their publishing label was Ultimate, and they effectively wrote arcade games on home computers, and that's why Jetpack and Lunar Jetman and a bunch of those games just stood right out. That was their mentality. And I've actually just realised, I haven't thought about this in all that time. I've just realised I basically, that's what we were trying to do. Everybody at Rare, everyone at Rare was trying to do that. And basically I pitched to these guys, we have written your game.
So you mentioned Battletoads there being the first kind of big IP that Rare kind of came up with. How involved were you in that? Because the Battletoads Game Boy version was great. It wasn't as difficult as the NES version. Was that kind of like a conscious move to make it a little bit easier? What, kind of talk to us about Battletoads there.
This is my standpoint on Battletoads. Okay, there are 5 people that are responsible for getting the Battletoads franchise off the ground. Mm-hmm. Tim had been to the States. He'd been to a CS show yet again. He'd come back, and my recollection is we were standing in a room. We were standing in Tim's office in the old farmhouse up the road at Rare in Twycross at the time. And Tim was there, Mark Betteridge was there, Kev Bayliss, myself. And Tim said, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles are big in the States. And there was a conversation that ensued. It wasn't very long. I don't know, 10 minutes maybe. And by the time we walked away from that conversation, there was an idea in the air that we were going to do some sort of amphibious beat 'em up, but with other elements game. What happened was Tim, who is an artist and designer, Mark, who's a computer programmer, Kev Bayliss, who designed the look of those original Battletoads, started working on the NES game, and Dave was working on the audio. Dave Wise was working on the audio. And then what happened was, and I'm in the Retro Gamer Mag that was published last week, and I have told a bit of this story in that. But I can't remember how long the NES game took to write. It was probably about 4, 5, 6 months. Mm-hmm. But somewhere in the middle of that, we just finished WWF Superstars, which was the first Game Boy title that I've just spoken about. And Tim came to Kev and I. We were rocking and rolling on Game Boy. We just banged this thing out very quickly. And he said, would you do a port of this Battletoad game we're writing right now? And I said no. And I said, look, if it's successful and we just do the exact same game on another platform, no one has bought it on NES, is going to go and buy it on Game Boy. I've got to write this thing from scratch because it's a different architecture. Why don't we just write it for a bit of extra design work? Why don't we just write a new Battletoad game that sits comfortably alongside the one that Mark and Tim and Kev were writing? Okay. And we would use some of the artwork, particularly on the first level. The first level of the first Game Boy one is actually the same artwork effectively as the first level on the NES one, but we redesigned the level. It's just laid out differently, right? So you start off kind of in the same universe, doing the same sorts of things, beating up pigs, getting the stick off the walker, taking its leg and hitting things with it, right? And then after that, Kev and I riffed, and we just went nuts and went off in a completely different direction, creating other levels. We had a sort of a jet ski level, which was a fast side scroller, which was basically based on the Speeder Bike level on the NES game. Yeah. So there was a closeness there, but there were subtle elements that were different on it, apart from the obvious graphical thing and the setting. And then there were some other levels that were just completely different altogether. So Tim, Mark, Kev, and Dave wrote the NES game, and about halfway through that, Kev, myself, and Dave wrote the Game Boy game, or started the Game Boy game. And that took, I don't know, a few months. It finished after the NES game finished production. Yeah. So basically the 5 of us wrote those 2 games. And then I went and wrote another 3 Battletoad games after that.
So in terms of the Battletoads, because I grew up playing the Battletoad games and had the Game Boy one, and they were such tough games. When you guys were making them, did you know they were this hard? Did you know people were really going to struggle, on the jet ski levels and stuff? On the turbo tunnel, I think it was called.
Right. So we started these in, when was it? 1990, 1991, sometime about then. So, you look at these things today and you can have a view on them. But actually at that time, our view of video games was everything that happened in the 1980s. And, maybe the really early stuff that came out in the 70s. And back in those days, you had the concept of 3 lives and you're dead. But in some games, if you were lucky enough, you could earn an extra life.
Yeah.
And a lot of games were structured around the concept of how far can you go. You just keep playing them and they get harder and harder and harder until you can't go any further. Space Invaders is a Galaxians. Those games never end.
Yeah.
You just keep going. It's how many levels can you survive until you finally die, and then you restart with 3 lives, right? So our concept of a video game back then was rock hard, not very forgiving, limited opportunity to gain extra lives. We didn't have restart points or anything like that. If you died, you went back to the start level and had to start again. And that was normal. It sounds mad today, but that's just how everybody looked. That's just what video games were back then, right?
Yeah.
So we did want to make them hard. I have very good memory of when I was working on the first Battletoad game, as I was getting levels, because, I'm not a great games player. Other people out there are much better than I am. But if I'm working on a level day in, day out, and I'm building it up and I'm constantly playtesting it myself, I am getting quite good at it. Okay. And it got to a point where a level would be nearly finished. I don't remember which one it was. And I remember going to get somebody out of our testing department to come and sit next to me at my desk and play the level. And they'd play it a few times and then they'd complete it. As soon as they completed it, I would go back in the software, I'd tweak some numbers and I'd make it a little bit faster, a little bit less forgiving, a little bit harder. And then I'd get him to play it again. And we'd play it and I'd let him play it for a bit. And if he managed to beat it, I'd go back and I'd make it harder. And I kept going until we got to a point when I'd given him a version of the game where sitting next to me, he could not complete the level, at which point I said, thank you very much, off you go. He'd leave, and job done. And I can't remember what the process Mark was using on the NES game. It was just him and Tim doing it, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
But I remember deliberately writing the levels until we got to a point where a really good games player from our testing department could not actually finish the level. And I thought that was mission accomplished. Well, sorry about the accessibility issues. In hindsight, we're big on accessibility these days. We're doing a lot on Sea of Thieves. Back then, weren't thinking about it so much. It was, how do we really annoy players and make these things as difficult as possible? And I'll tell you what. About some years ago, maybe 10 years ago now, I remember this for me is a real badge of honor. I can't remember the guy's name, but the chap that started Groupon, he was the CEO of a company called Groupon, and he retired, stood down, left the company, and he put out an email to, I think he went out public rather than just to all the staff there, and it was fairly short and sweet email. And it basically said, look, I started this company, I've loved working here, I've loved everything we've accomplished, thank you, team. And then at one point he said, building a company like this is every bit as hard as the speeder bike level on Battletoads. And I thought, yeah. Right, 20 years later, and that's his childhood reference, and he's used it. I thought, fantastic.
That's brilliant, that is. Also, I don't know if you've heard of him, but the Angry Video Game Nerd, he literally, one of the biggest kind of internet celebrities for retro gaming, essentially became famous because of the speeder bike levels and how angry he was getting at them as well. And now he's one of the biggest YouTubers out there, which I love as well.
I don't think there's a real need to get angry at it. I hope he was not disparaging of its creators.
No. It was all for fun and stuff like that. But you mentioned you went on to obviously, make the sequels, work on the sequels to the Battletoads games as well. One burning question I want to ask is Battletoads and Double Dragon. How did that come about? How involved with that were you?
Well, I wrote Battletoads Double Dragon on the Game Boy.
Brilliant.
So that was the one I did on Game Boy was actually a port of the one that we did on. Was that on NES? I can't remember.
It was on NES and Super Nintendo and Mega Drive.
Okay.
It was on. Yeah.
Oh, we did it on Mega Drive. I don't think that was handled in house. Somebody out of house must have done that one.
Yeah.
Okay. I do have a vague recollection that something was done on Mega Drive, and we were asking internally a while back. Did Rare ever do a Sega game? And I had a vague recollection we did something, but I couldn't remember how or why or when. Okay, well, look, I've already said that we try to get away from all the other people's IPs and everything. But, Battletoads. We had an agent in America, Joel Hochberg, and he was brilliant at what he did, and he kept signing licenses to things, and all the Battletoads games were published by Trade West, and they had the license to Double Dragon. And basically, there was a meeting at some manager level. I don't know. Tim and Chris had a meeting. Joel had a meeting. Someone had a meeting, and it was decided to put them in there. I think they were just trying to boost the sales of Battletoad games. We kept on writing them. This went on for a while. I think we were writing them for about 3 years, really. And somebody just had the brainwave, why don't we just put Double Dragon in Battletoads? I'll be honest with you, I detested the idea. I'm not a fan of beat-em-up games. Kev is a huge fan of beat-em-up games. So I hated the idea, but I did it. I thought it came off all right. I don't know why somebody thought it was a good idea. It was pretty much, let's slam 2 IPs together and see if we can do some marketing off the back of it. It was a bit like Alien versus Predator, just at a lower scale kind of thing, I do recall we never got any hassle. I was fearful at the time that we'd get some hassle off the IP owners of Double Dragon. They'd say, oh, you're mucking about with our characters. But I don't remember getting any negative feedback or anything that I had to go and do in particular. So, I wrote it in a few months. Kev did the art, Dave did the audio. Hey, it's I sound like a stuck record at this point. That's pretty much what Rare was like back then. Same people doing the same projects, lots of them quickly. That was that.
I was going to say, it's as a child playing that game, because that was another one I played a lot of, you think, it's Battletoads and Double Dragon, but as an adult, it is a Battletoads game with the Double Dragon guys in it, It's not until you go back and you play it and you realise that. So it's good to hear that, there wasn't much meddling and, back and forth like there was with LGN and stuff. No,
it was definitely our game that we put the Double Dragons characters into. It was simple as that.
Brilliant. And just last thing not on Double Dragon, sorry, just the last thing on Battletoads. What's the story behind the cancelled Battletoads Game Boy game? There was one that was 100% complete and it got cancelled. What's the story there?
I can think of somebody at Rare who would rather I didn't say anything right now, and I will apologise to him later. Look, we already spoke about this in the wake of Rare Replay. In fact, we put out a video on YouTube. James Thomas, I think, told a bit about the story. He started off with, it's mad enough cancelling a level from a video game, but how about, cancelling a whole video game? Long story short, we wrote Super Battletoads on the Game Boy. It's the 4th one. It was completely finished. And then Trade West pulled the plug on the franchise. The arcade one had just come out and just hadn't done very well as far as they were concerned. And they just went, you know what, this franchise is 3 years old. The latest release didn't perform in the way that they wanted it to. They pulled the plug. And we had a finished game and it never came out. I'd actually moved on to Donkey Kong Land. We were, a few weeks or a couple of months into Donkey Kong Land at that point. And somebody came to me, might have been Tim, I can't remember who it was. Somebody came to me and said, look, Paul, it's cancelled. And you know what? I spent a few months of my life. I'd worked hard on it. There was some amazing stuff in there because by that point we were massively, heavily experimenting with the rendering tech, the heavy levels of frame animation that we could get, which was leading into Donkey Kong Country. And so that Battletoad game actually, instead of having hand-drawn 3-frame walks, it had 16-frame walks that were rendered on a giant SGI machine overnight. And there was stuff in there that looks absolutely spectacular. By the way, same on the arcade one, we were using rendering tech on that one by that point as well. And it's just that we'd got it to a stage that by the time DKC came out, everything in it was fully rendered. So, yeah, I was annoyed. I was frustrated at the time. It was just, bugger. Was my attitude. But I was already into another game and we were starting to build a team around that, which got up to about 15 people to write Donkey Kong Land. And I was just heads down on that. And it's a shame, but that's life.
Well, Paul, you mentioned Donkey Kong Land and we're going to talk about that at another time. I think we're going to continue this. We've got something planned. Donkey Kong Land, Banjo and Kazooie, of course, and Donkey Kong Country 3. But time has absolutely flied having you on and there's some absolutely amazing stories. So thank you so much for coming on the Retro Hour.
You're most welcome. Thank you so much for asking me. And I'm really sorry if I rambled anywhere or accidentally nearly swore.
You did not ramble at all. And any swearing, we can cut it out and bleep it and stuff. But that's been absolutely amazing. We do have about another 15 questions to go, but we are going to save them for next
We're
time.
going to save them for later.
Because they are
for the next time.
They are all about Donkey Kong, and obviously you mentioned there the rendering and essentially how Donkey Kong Country for the Game Boy with the yellow cart and everything is the most beautiful Game Boy game ever. So I've got a lot to ask about that.
Okay,
Fantastic.
no worries.
Thank you so much, Paul.